Jerry, Jerry. Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. Do not adjust your television sets. I'm not President Elizabeth. She is away this week, and after calling a lot of qualified folks, she got to me and said, "Hey, can you run the meeting today?" If you didn't know, earlier this week, we celebrated two holidays that have different meanings, but get celebrated on the same day: Indigenous Peoples Day and also Columbus Day, recognizing not only the arrival of Columbus in the New World, but also that he was not the first person here, and that there were cultures and individuals here, and those who, frankly, things did not go so well for them. And we'll talk a little bit about that actually during the inspirational message as well. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. The four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all? Our inspirational message today, a few weeks ago, past President Amy called and said, for October service, do you think you'll be at the meeting on October 14th? And I said, well, yes, actually, Elizabeth just reached out and I'm running the meeting, so I will be there. So I am doing double duty. You can be seated. So last week, many of you know, Camille and I like to take cruises as vacations, and we haven't been able to do that in the last couple of years. And last week was our first cruise since the pandemic. Two of the stops we went to actually were on the island of Hispaniola, which is one of the islands that Columbus reached his voyage in 1492. The people who he encountered there are called the Taino people. And there were many artifacts and areas of their culture still being celebrated, both in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic, recognizing their culture, their language. As our tour guide will talk about things that say what the name of a particular mountain was in Spanish, but they would also say what the name of the mountain was in the Taino language as well. On our cruise, it was interesting. It was our first time in this particular line, and they're just ramping up with this particular ship. So they were half capacity, but there were 965 crew on the ship. They were from 64 different countries. Their name badges just said the country they were from, and there was every continent represented except, of course, Antarctica. And I got to thinking about that and thinking about Indigenous Peoples Day and recognizing that they were able to work together. All those different cultures, languages, religions. The captain actually talked about this during one of his talks and how special that was. And yes, they're doing the job. Yes, they're getting a paycheck, but they don't have to get along. They don't have to be friends. You would sometimes hear people of the same culture or language speaking their native tongue, maybe the dining room, to shout out instructions. But you also saw people laughing and smiling and hanging out from all different cultures one of the crew actually thought that I was part of his culture. He thought I was Dominican because he was Dominican. And I said, no, that was funny. And we went to the Dominican and people started speaking Spanish to me. And I said, okay, maybe he's on to something. But it was just wonderful. And I just thought about that with Monday's holiday as well. That was just a special thing for us to celebrate and to be an example for us of a multicultural world, that you can have your own culture, your own language. You don't have to not be who you are, but you can also love and befriend others who are different from you. So with that, I hope you enjoy your lunch. We have a great agenda, a great speaker who is not a guest, one of our own, Michael J. Thorpe. And so I'll let you enjoy your meal, and Ed and Brian will chat on the Zoom. We'll be back together in about 10 minutes.
Kyle, do we need to do a room?
Came down for dinner. It was just such a great weekend.
Sounds like an amazing weekend.
It really was. It was fabulous. And now I'm back.
Now you're back.
I only missed, that's not true. I missed a day and a half. I came back Monday morning. And it felt a lot longer than that.
Yeah, those
How
long
much longer
weekends.
does he have at Yale?
This is his last year. I had never been to Parents Weekend. This was my last chance, so I went. It was great.
Joe Martin.
I think we're about to get muted.
Joe
Yeah.
Martin. All right, welcome back, everyone. A few other items from today's calendar. Today is Spider-Man Day, World Egg Day, National Lowercase Day. Any fans of bell hooks? There's one person got that joke. Okay. Her name, she writes it lowercase. So. It's Be Bald and Be Free Day. So I see a few people that are celebrating. Be Bald and Be Free. Joe Martin on Zoom, Ed Fletcher on Zoom. I'm on my way, but it's going to be a few years before I get there with you. It's also National Dessert Day, and I saw some cookies and pie over on the side. And we're going to hear more about Michigan facts. But one fact that is today is the 38th anniversary of the Tigers winning the World Series in 1984. So for those of you who have forgotten what playoff baseball was like, look back to 1984. One other great thing that we have tonight, at halftime of the Powers Catholic football game, Flint's own and Flint Rotary's own Judge Duncan Beagle will be honored, given a Judge Beagle, who snuck in there in the back, will be honored, will be given a key to the city by the mayor. And for his contributions not only to the entire community, but especially to Atwood Stadium. But I think without Judge Beagle and maybe Norm Bryant and a couple other folks, Atwood would not be what it is today. It may not even be usable by the public without their work. So Judge Beagle, we thank you so much for your dedication to our community and particularly to the athletes of our community. Speaking of athletes, we had an interesting time since the last time I was with you all out in San Francisco, California. There was a practice you may have heard about. There was an altercation at practice. One Draymond Green punched Jordan Poole. Now, Draymond Green is a MSU, and Jordan Poole went to where? Michigan. So a Spartan kind of cold clocked Wolverine. And I see a Notre Dame fan in the back talking, not paying attention. And then this week on campus, there have been some interesting things. Today actually is the first day of Santa Ono, who I believe is the 15th president in the history of the University of Michigan. Meanwhile, on the banks of the Red Cedar, it's a little bit messy. So between the messiness and Draymond Green, Spartans need to put $1 in the cup. There's no Spartan fans here? I don't see any dollars going in the cup. Not today? Okay. Some announcements. Next week, our meeting will take place here at noon. It'll be on Thursday. Everyone say Thursday. Thursday. If you come here on Friday, Miss Cynthia will look at you and say, wrong day. Okay? Thursday. You've heard about it, you've talked about it. Thursday, October 20th, here at the food bank. This is to accommodate another event that they have going on that day. We're going to ask Joe Fike, who has brought a guest with him, Luke Zelli, to come up and speak. And Joel has already, I think, prepaid the fine. And so I'm going to ask them to come up and make an announcement.
Good afternoon, everybody. Employers all over the country are being urged this month to hire people with disabilities. Here to talk more about that is my boss, the Chief Amazement Officer at the Disability Network, Luke Zelli.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Zelli. I'm the president of the Disability Network. Joel's my boss, really tells me what to do and where to go. I did want to take just a quick minute. I know you're here to hear Michael, not me, but 5 years ago, I got invited to a Rotary meeting. Actually, it was my dad, Mike Zelli, was invited. He was sick and I got to step in for him that day. And if any of you know my father, he was a hero in the community, the disability community. And he passed away just this past June and left a really big mark. But this was his favorite month every year, Disability Employment Month. He was someone who was working at a bank as a vice president, hit a patch of ice on the way home. His car flipped, broke his neck and paralyzed. And 3 months later, this is way back in 1979, his employer invited him back to work in 3 months. So we got work to do. They did an accommodation. They just moved his office from the 3rd floor to the 1st. And before they even had accessible parking spaces, they gave him a spot right next to the door. So employers, when they see talent, when they see people, they just hire them. And so on this month, October, I want to share a couple of things that folks with disabilities, and we think about Flint and the environment we have here, whether it's the water impact, Michigan School for the Deaf, COVID, there's a variety of reasons why Flint has a high population of folks with disabilities. And 70% of them aren't working and they want to work. And so they're just looking for a chance or for an opportunity. And so there's 3 things I'd like you to think about or consider. So one, I'd like you to rethink what disability is, because many people, they think of my dad, a person in a wheelchair, Judge Beagle in the back, a member of our board. Hello, Judge. Or you think of somebody who's blind or somebody who's deaf. Really, disability is so much more than that. It's people with diabetes, it's people with learning disabilities. It's as you age, things get a little more difficult. You still have talent, you still have value. So as you think about disabilities, broaden that pool of folks when it comes to hiring. Second thing you can do is there's a stigma around disability. If you have a disability, if it's diabetes, if it's high cholesterol, seasonal mood disorders, so many different things. Talk about it. It helps remove some of that stigma. And then I think the last thing I would encourage you to do, it's always difficult when somebody looks, walks, or talks different than you. And for folks with disabilities, the more you can engage, the more you can see the person, just like my father's employer 50 years ago did. There's great disability organizations here in Genesee County, whether it's Michigan School for the Deaf, the Autism Resource Center, the Disability Network, Community Mental Health. I'd encourage you to volunteer, go to a community event, engage with students and youth with disabilities. There's a lot of talent out there. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be here in front of you. Remember my dad, who was my hero, and the work that he did on employment. And I hope when you leave today, you think about that. So thank you.
I think I heard your future sponsor in the back. That's awesome. Thank you, Luke. Thank you for the great presentation, and certainly thank you for the work that Disability Network does in our community as well. Next up, and I'm not sure if it'll be you or both. Okay. Past President Amy Cruz and member of our board Joe Martin are going to speak to you about our service committee.
You go, or how does that work?
Let me unmute you.
Hello, all. Good afternoon.
Here's Joe. Okay. So Joe and I are on the service committee for the club. And we also work with Raphael Turner, and we're open to new members. So anybody that's interested in being part of that work. we really want to hear from Rotarians about opportunities that are out there in our community that we can be part of. We don't think it's necessary for our club to try to create new things because there's so many amazing and worthy organizations that are out there doing projects that we could be part of. Ideally, what we would like to do is to develop a calendar of events, so possibly one every month, where Rotarians could choose to be part of that service opportunity. So what we have before you is just a form, something that you could tell us about how can we be of service. So we do hope, I see Connie over there, we hope to still do our service to the food bank, but we're looking, maybe we'll do it after a meeting or before a meeting rather than trying to do it on a Saturday. We know folks are very busy. So if you know of service opportunities in our community, just kind of describe those for us real quick. Any logistics, if you know that. If you don't know the logistics, but you know, oh, Disability Network has a run in September, and then write Luke's name down, and we would call Luke and say, hey, well, how can we help? Anything like that. So just kind of let us know places and events that maybe you already volunteer at that you would think Rotarians could join you and would benefit from that, or opportunities you'd like to learn more about. We can do the legwork and the research. So just take a moment throughout the club meeting while Michael's talking, maybe just subtly write some things down. Pay attention to Michael. Okay, act like you're taking notes from Michael and write things on the form. We'll be collecting those. We just really want to hear from folks. If you want to go back to your office and think about it for a little bit, just shoot us an email. That works as well. We hope to come back, present this to the club, and then provide opportunities to expand our opportunities for service. So thank you very much. Joe, anything you want to add to that?
No, just again, just emphasizing the multiple pathways to servicing the club, looking at trying to get a good mixture of weekend, after work opportunities, both, opportunities that may be more physical in nature. So, maybe your typical park cleanup and those that would be less. So just again, I think having a large variety of opportunities and finding those that Rotarians would be passionate about. So if you have a passion about a specific service opportunity and want to take the lead on that, Amy and I would be more than happy to. I think the more engaged you are into that opportunity, I think it'll show with other members and you'll get them excited about that opportunity. So I think that the idea here was not to have it be Amy and Joe coming up with ideas, although I'm certain we probably could. They may not be as engaging, as exciting for the rest of the members. So that's it. Reach out to Amy and I with any questions, thoughts, or and we'll take it from there.
Thank you.
I looked at my phone and there was a text from past President Amy saying, did Elizabeth add you to the agenda? I said, President Elizabeth is a lot more organized than I was because I had it posted over here with things scribbled down and she's got a step-by-step agenda to go by. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Joe, for that great presentation. As many of you know, the Paul Harris Fellowship is named for Paul Harris, who founded Rotary with 3 business associates in Chicago in 1905. The fellowship was established in his honor in 1957 to express appreciation for the contribution of $1,000 or more to the humanitarian and educational programs of the Rotary Foundation. These programs include an array of projects that save and invigorate the lives of people around the world and enhance international friendship and understanding. Foundation programs provide educational opportunities, food, potable water, healthcare, immunization, shelter for millions of persons, and a sustainable environment. These activities are funded, implemented, and managed by Rotarians and Rotary clubs around the globe. Rotarians also designate a Paul Harris Fellow to recognize another person whose life demonstrates the shared purpose with the objectives and mission of the Rotary Foundation to build world understanding and peace. We move closer to a peaceful world today because Stephen Lowe becomes a Paul Harris Fellow. Stephen, your contribution to the Rotary Foundation of Rotary International is allaying suffering improving living conditions and providing educational opportunities for young people somewhere and around the world. This is truly a selfless action. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to present to you on behalf of the trustees of the Rotary Foundation these emblems of a Paul Harris Fellow. The certificate states that you have been named a Paul Harris Fellow in appreciation. Notice it says in the script, I'll make sure it actually says it on your certificate. Stephen C. Lowe is hereby named a Paul Harris Fellow in appreciation of tangible and significant assistance given for the furtherance of better understanding and world and friendly relations among the peoples of the world. And it's signed by the chair of the Rotary Foundation and the president of Rotary International. We urge you also, Stephen, to wear your Paul Harris pin, which is right here, to all Rotary events as a symbol of your appreciation and support of the programs of the Rotary Foundation. Please accept congratulations and sincere appreciation for your commitment to our common goals of world understanding and peace. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise as we're able to recognize our newest Paul Harris Fellow. I'm not sure who is here to take a picture. Oh, there she is. Oh, no, Connie's behind you. Connie's behind you. Oh, Gassan, if you want to be in the picture, I think it's appropriate.
I just want to express my appreciation. It's a real honor to be part of this Rotary Club in such esteemed company as Paul Harris members. Thank you.
The only one when I think of the word humanitarian, you are one of the people that certainly come to mind with your work in and around our community. Thank you very much. We have the privilege of announcing the winner of our most recent joke duel between Dawn Hibbert and Jerry Hill. And the winner, drum roll, was Dawn Hibbert. And many thanks both to Dawn and to Jerry for their participation. Are there any health and welfare updates? Hearing none, are there any guests to be welcomed? I don't see any on Zoom. Yes. What's the name of the band? So I think based on that, all of my long-core employees are going to put $1 in the cup. Thank you, Paul, for joining us. Paul Ruzicki has, especially in an even number year, I feel like you have better attendance than some Rotarians. So I appreciate you being here. Next up is our 50-50. Yeah.
I went to a Division II school, and tomorrow, #1 rated first plays #2 rated Grand Valley. So it's the Ingerbone Trophy is at stake. Grand Valley.
Dr. Bobby had a confused look on his face as he was describing Division II football.
Luke to draw. Up there. Third place, 8-4.
350, third place. All right, Gene Dennis.
8-4.
375, second place.
Is it yours?
Three, 340. Well, speaking of Jerry Hill, Jerry Hill, who just won our 50-50, is now up to introduce our speaker, Paul Rizicki. Jerry?
Good afternoon.
I follow what it says on the.
Okay.
Can we find President Elizabeth for having fun?
Good afternoon, all. First time I've been paid to be up here. Very fortunate to have one of our members that has a lot of work that he's done in writing and their visual things. And I'm going to tell you about it. Michael J. Thorpe is a Rotarian and, more importantly, in a way, a grandpa. I'll let him tell you about that. Michael J. is an Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, producer, television and news anchor, radio personality, and author who has been telling his stories for decades on radio, television, and in his books. He is the host, writer, and producer of the Emmy-winning Capitol Memories, a television podcast featuring Flint Historic Capitol Theater. In his sixth book, Michiganians You Should Know, is about familiar names of people and some not so familiar in Michigan, and why do we or why should we know who they are? So I'd like to welcome Michael J. Thorpe.
Or am I Paul Rizicki? You get to decide. I wanted to start by saying that Duncan Beagle is one of my heroes. He's a Flint kid like me, and we've been friends for a very long time. I've watched you forever, and I'm always honored to be able to call you a friend. And I just got a text from the Acme Locksmith Company saying that they had heard you were going to get the keys to the city, offering a special on changing all the locks in our town. Anytime that you need that. So the joke takes nothing away from how much I hold you in high regard. Also, our Paul Harris fellow, Steve, you're going to pay a fine because I'm going to tell you quickly about our 10th annual Humanity and Harmony concert, which is a week from Saturday over at the Flint Institute of Music's MacArthur, the MacArthur recital. What we did was, with the Flint Jewish Federation and all of our projects, we hired Dan Hall, a local folk singer and writer, to write a song with the 4th grade and Flushing schools. 75 kids in the 4th grade wrote a song. They're going to have their world premiere and world release at our show a week from Saturday. Also, Eddie Blues Barney's going to play the blues for us, and the Dort Honors Quartet will also be there, along with Sheldon and Hadar, who happen to be the son and son-in-law of Stephen. So anyway, there's that. I've done my business. Stephen will pay the fine. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. My book, Michiganians You Should Know, and some you do and don't know why. when we first came back after the pandemic, I talked about my book. I did the first meeting, and I talked about the Michiganians you should know. And I decided maybe today we should talk about those you do and you don't know why. And I wanted to start by telling you maybe why. I grew up in Flint, up in the North End, and I can remember riding around with my mom or my grandma. And I'm one of those kind of kids that always looked at signs and names and wondered why. So it's the most important question a newsman can ask. Why, right? I remember being a kid and driving by Lloyd G. Copeman Boulevard when I was a little kid. How many of you grew up in Flint and have seen Copeman Boulevard around our town somewhere? How many of you thought, who the heck was Lloyd Copeman? Well, I did, but I never did anything about it. That may be a pivotal point in my life, believe it or not. Driving by at 7 or 8 years old and seeing the Copeman sign, because finally I looked it up and I started looking up all kinds of other things. So let me tell you a little bit about Lloyd G. Copeman. He was one of America's greatest inventors, second only to Thomas Edison, with well over 700 patents. And every one of you have used one of his patents. He invented the electric stove. He invented it here in Flint. He invented the electric stove. Basically, it's the stove you have in your house today is the same design he created here 100 years ago. He was born in Hadley Township and lived in Metamora for many, many years. He had 3 children, which is kind of another interesting thing. And one of his daughters moved to Arizona, married a guy named Ronstadt, whose daughter was Linda Ronstadt. Linda spent time in Flint visiting her grandpa, Lloyd G. Copeman. I was always fascinated about that. The rock and rollers always loved that story. When he was very young, he was always inventing stuff. When he was very young, according to family stories, he invented this little machine that would give his fellow students a zap in the outhouse, in the privy. So when they sat down, it would zzz. He didn't patent that one, but he probably could have, because it would have made a lot of money for him. In 1909, he had a patent. His first patent was for a heat regulator that gave a warning when high tension wires were ready to burn out. It's that same thing that they use in electric stoves. Copeman and his friend, J. Dallas Dort, he loved his idea about the new stove. So Dallas Dort got a bunch of his friends to gather some money together so he could start a lab, which was over at Factory 1 on the 2nd floor. He had a lab up there. So the stove, by the way, in the end, it worked so well that Westinghouse bought the patent. Later, his wife and he were in a store, and you remember, I don't know how many of you ever saw the toasters where you put the toast in and you had to flip them around and flip the bread around. Oh, the older of us probably remember some of that. We had one at our cabin. It was the one that my grandma and grandpa found in their basement, so we used it up at their cottage. He and his wife went to a store one time, and his wife said, "Why don't you make something, a better toaster, so we didn't have to flip it around?" He did. And then Westinghouse kind of stole the idea, but they realized that they had to put his name on it. So it was on their toasters, the same toaster that he created, they had using Copeman's patent. Westinghouse, once again, bought the patent. And now that's why you can buy Westinghouse toasters. Westinghouse also bought his lab. Westinghouse was really big in Lloyd Copeman's life. He also invented the rubber ice cube tray. And well, like I said, over 700 things that you use often. He died in 1956, by the way, in Lapeer County. His last patent happened just before he passed away. It was for a beer dispenser and cooler. He was into everything. Jerry wanted me to talk a little bit about the Civil War. I've done a couple of shows on the Civil War over the years. And one of the stories I remember reading on the radio, talking about the Polacks up at Sault Ste. Marie. I say it with half a smile on my face, but you can imagine, a 22-year-old kid who has no idea what the locks were about, talking about Polacks up in the Upper Peninsula. Is that a joke? No, it was not a joke. It was a story about the Polacks was created by General Orlando Poe, a graduate of West Point He graduated like sixth in his class. He also designed like a dozen lights. I'm trying to say satellites, but that's not what I'm talking about. But all the lights, like the pole locks, he designed the locks up there. He was an engineer. He was also worked with General McClellan in the protection of Washington, D.C. and the Civil War. He followed Sherman's march to the sea. He built all the bridges for General Sherman. He dismantled the cities as he went through. But after the war, he ended up back in Michigan, and he was in charge of all of the lights. He built a good portion of them, and it was just everywhere you look. I mean, the Presqu'île light, the South Manitou Island light, the most the Standard Rock light in Lake is in Lake Superior, 24 miles offshore. They say it's one of the greatest engineering feats in history. It was done by General Orlando Poe, who deserves to be remembered. Even though we all knew his name, we just didn't realize it was actually a name, perhaps. I always had that. I think I've asked you this question before. If I ask, there's two things these people have in common: Houghton, Higgins, Burt, and Mullet. They're all lakes. What's the second thing? Oh, okay, there's three things. Smart. They were all surveyors, amazing surveyors, and they're the surveyors that basically laid out all of Michigan. And not surprisingly, they all knew each other. They worked together and they were friends. So they kind of named things after each other. William Burke, for example, he was a scientist, an inventor, a legislator, a justice of the peace, a postmaster, a builder, and a businessman. He built sawmills, starting his career around Port Huron. But he was basically a surveyor. He surveyed the boundaries between Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. And by the way, the Wisconsin survey is still under dispute. After all these years, maybe he didn't do something quite right, who knows. He performed the survey for the Sioux Locks. He invented the first typewriter. The first typewriter. I don't know whether you bless him or not for that. He also invented a solar compass for surveying. Because when he was up in the Upper Peninsula surveying, all the iron deposits up there messed up his compass. So he had to find another way to do that. So he created that. He also invented the equatorial sextant. He's a pretty brilliant guy. He did the survey for Forkinson Lake in 1852, and he renamed it Higgins Lake for his friend, Sylvester Higgins. Now, Sylvester was born in Connecticut and probably ended up in Detroit about 1835. He joined Douglas Houghton, another famous name in Michigan, in a survey of Michigan. And he also, he drew up most of the original maps of Michigan, complete with illustrations. He was quite an able illustrator. Let me see here. I've lost my place because I'm not wearing my glasses. Higgins left Detroit in 1849. After surveying all these lakes and all these places. They say, and it's kind of dark and cloudy here, they say he may have submitted false surveys of the Upper Peninsula. So he booked passage. This is kind of interesting. He booked passage with some other Detroiters, and they went to basically New York and hopped on a ship called the Loo Choo that went around the Horn, South America, to go to San Francisco in 1849. Look for gold. They got out there and he realized the people who make money here are not the ones that are looking for gold. He went to work for Mr. Suter. You know what he did for Mr. Suter? He surveyed his property. Mr. Suter, at Mr. Suter's mines is where the gold was first originally found. So that's where he found his opportunities there. Then when things didn't work out, it didn't work out a lot. He ended up going to Texas, where he started a sheep ranch. And then he kind of got drafted into the Texas militia, where he became a major. And he served for about 3 months. He didn't go anywhere or do anything, but he surveyed something for a fort there. And in the end, he died in 1866 at 67 and came back to Michigan. Douglas Houghton. This is an amazing, amazing character. Douglas Houghton is probably the most important person in Michigan history, other than maybe Lewis Cass. Born in New York, but when he was a brilliant guy. They say that he was described as small for his age, with a nervous, active temperament, had a slight speech impediment, and some facial scarring because of an accident with a gun. When he was 20, he entered something called the Rensselaer School in Troy, New York, where he studied geology. He was a very good student. He graduated within a year and began to teach the same thing at that university. And then he decided, well, I don't want to be just a geologist. I'm also going to be a doctor. So he went to medical school and became a physician when he was 22 years old. Meanwhile, Detroit is growing, and they need smart young people to be teachers. And so Lewis Cass reached out to the director of the school and asked for their suggestion, and it was Douglas. Douglas Houghton came to Detroit, where he was called the good doctor. And young men started gathering around him. He was only 23 years old. Young men, they called themselves Houghton's boys. And they all were working for the state, for the growth of our great state of Michigan. And then Henry Rose Schoolcraft, you've heard about him before. He was a U.S. Indian agent and a geologist. He hired Houghton to be the physician botanist. What an interesting combo. On his expeditions through Lake Superior, looking for the source of the Mississippi River, which, by the way, they found. Mr. Schoolcraft called it Lake Itasca. He just made it. On the expeditions, Houghton wrote about the plants he discovered, including Houghton's goldenrod, which was named for him. And he inoculated hundreds of Native Americans along the way. In 1836, he kind of backed off from medicine and started working on his real estate holdings. This is interesting. In 1837, Michigan officially got its statehood, and the first bill that was passed in the Michigan House was to appoint Douglas Houghton as the state's geologist. First one. He was asked to serve as the president of the University of Michigan. He said no because he wanted to continue to do his surveys. He did accept the position. He was the first professor of geology at U of M, and his collection is at U of M to this day. He found copper in the Upper Peninsula. He's the one that found the copper. They call him the father of copper mining in the U.S. He was just everywhere. In 1845, in October 13th, which would have been, that's yesterday. It was a terrible day in Michigan. He had volunteered. The federal government wanted a survey done up in Upper Michigan, and Michigan needed one done but couldn't afford it, so he volunteered to do it way late in the season. He knew better, but he went anyway, and he ended up drowning up in northwestern Michigan, lower Michigan. He was 45 years old. He had so much more to do. He was supposed to be governor. He was president-elect and founder of an organization that would become the American Association of the Advancements of Science. One of the most interesting stories about him, two of them actually, he was off on one of his treks, the one with Mr. Schoolcraft. And while he was gone, people nominated him to be mayor of Detroit. He didn't know, they never asked him. He got back and he found out he was mayor of Detroit. And that almost happened when he went on the last trek of his life. They wanted to nominate him for governor, but they decided they would wait till the next time. They went, it took a year. They went back and found Mr. Houghton's body a year later up there, and he's buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit. One of the reasons I wrote my books, all of them, I tell little stories about Michigan because I want people to be so interested. They want to learn more. If you want to know more about Douglas Houghton, and he's worth knowing, my friend Steve Lato has written a great book. It's called Douglas Houghton, Michigan's Columbus. A great book about him. John Mullet, I wanted to get through this one real quick. Be sure you tell me when you got to go to your meeting. He's from Vermont. And in 1807, his family moved to Genesee County, New York. Well, he ended up moving to Michigan, like a lot of those people that came from Genesee County, New York, to come to places like Genesee County, Michigan. He served as an officer in the War of 1812, but he was only in one battle. But Colonel Mullet then ended up in Detroit, and he moved. He was a tailor. His family were tailors, and they taught math. But he liked being the surveyor better, and he was appointed Surveyor General for the Northwest Territories. He also, Lewis Cass appointed him Surveyor of Michigan, and he was a surveyor, Deputy Surveyor General of the United States. These people were big time in all of that. He published the first survey of private property in Mackinac Island, and his efforts to survey the Fox River and Wisconsin River in Wisconsin were ended by the Black Hawk War. Once again, amazing. Edmund Fitzgerald, I promised I wouldn't say, so I won't. But you know, the legend, it lives on from the Chippewa on down to the big lake they call Gitchigooey. Edmund Fitzgerald was the name of an amazing, the largest craft on the Great Lakes at its time. And we all know what happened when the bells of November rang early. It was a 729-foot ore carrier. It couldn't be any larger because it wouldn't have fit through the pole locks. That's why it couldn't, and they're still talking about enlarging the pole locks. He was actually a member of the family that had an insurance company in Milwaukee. And he was chairman of the board of that insurance company. And he loved ships. Actually, his grandfather had been a lake captain. His father built ships for the Great Lakes. And according to the stories, the board of directors of the wanted to name this great ship for Mr. Fitzgerald. He wouldn't hear of it. He didn't want it. So they had a secret meeting without him and named it for him. I've always found that one. So an insurance executive. Have you ever heard of Daniel J. Morrell? Some of you probably had names. Daniel J. Morrell was another freighter in the Great Lakes. And it's famous because the 603-foot freighter broke up in a storm. 28 of the 29 people aboard died. Everybody except for a guy named Dennis Owens. He was found basically frozen in a life raft a day or two later. They didn't even know it sank until a day later because, you know, it didn't show up and it was supposed to. So the reason we know the story is because of because Dennis survived the whole thing. It's interesting to note that Daniel J. Morrell was actually from Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. He was a banker, bank president, ended up serving in Congress for a couple of terms. And he came back and he joined a company. Let me see, it was a club, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. He joined it because he didn't like the look of the dam. The dam just didn't look right to him. And he joined, became a member of the board, and he practically begged them to check it. He offered his own company to check it. He went to court. They refused. They refused. Of course, on May 31st, 1889, the Great Johnstown Flood happened, killing hundreds, 22 hundreds of people in Johnstown. And Daniel J. Morrell had been warning and warning and warning forever. So that's the only reason I can think of, because it was like 15 years later that they named the Daniel J. Morrell for him. But that is why, most likely, that happened. Thomas Selfridge, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. It's Selfridge Air Force Base. We've all heard of it. So who was Selfridge? Well, it's one of, by the way, Selfridge is one of 32 bases built in 1917 for World War I. So why was it named for a man who never came to Michigan? He was an aviation pioneer. He was the first military officer to pilot a modern plane. That happened in 1908, and the first person to die in a plane crash in 1908, the same year. You think after all, they've been flying for quite a while, he was the first one to die. But he was the son of an admiral, born in San Francisco. His brother, Edward, was one of Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. I'm saying he's going. He wanted to be in aviation and he got it. So The Army was looking to buy a plane from the famous Orville and Wilbur Wright. And they wanted somebody to test the craft, and they chose Thomas Selfridge. They were going to fly the 1908 Wright Flyer. The Wright brothers didn't like Selfridge. Selfridge was working for one of their competitors, and they thought he was going to steal their ideas and give back to their competitor. They did not want Selfridge there. They didn't like it, and that's why. There's another part of the story that's kind of interesting too. That's Theodore Roosevelt wanted to fly in that plane that day. He had already gone down in a submarine the year before. If you've done any study on Theodore Roosevelt, you know that he was a pretty wild guy. He would try, and he was a tough, and he was always moving forward. And he was supposed to be on the plane that day. Finally, his advisors convinced him that he should. Thank God that he did it. Because that day, Orville was terribly hurt. He lived with the pain literally the rest of his life. But Selfridge died. Selfridge died because he refused to wear a helmet. Even though Orville was wearing a helmet, he refused. So that's why there's a rule. If you're piloting, and they put it, if you're piloting a plane in a case like that, you have to be wearing a helmet. That's Thomas Selfridge. So it's kind of interesting, here he is, not very well liked by the Wright brothers, but still, he gets 2 flights and he's done. For Jared, I want to talk a little bit about George Armstrong Custer. We all know who he is. He was actually from Monroe, Michigan, New Rumley, Ohio. He grew up in Monroe, Michigan, and there's a few notes about him that's kind of interesting, just to kind of pass on here. He was dating this young woman named Elizabeth in Monroe, whose father was a businessman. He didn't like young Mr. Custer very well. And so he was trying to find a way to get him out of college. He talked to a local friend of his who happened to be a congressman, who gave him an appointment to West Point, thus getting Mr. Custer out of town. It worked. He got out of town, but only worked for a while because Elizabeth Bacon, who later became Elizabeth Bacon Custer, was not to be denied herself. And she's waited for the general to come back home. Custer was last in his class when he graduated early because of the Civil War. He was the first to become a general at the age of 23. Think about that. What were you doing when you were 23? I should not have been a general. He was a general because he was crazy. We've talked about that before. He would do anything. He was hunting for glory, and he found it. A general. He was near a general. I can't think of the name right now. One time along a river, and the general wondered out loud, I wonder how deep that river is, where we can cross it. Next thing we know, Custer spurred his horse. Lieutenant Custer spurred his horse. He races down to the river, and he plunges in. And he gets halfway across the river, and he turns around and he says, "It's this deep, sir." Later that day, Captain Custer was given command of his own unit. That's how you move ahead sometimes in the U.S. Army. He was a fascinating character. Let's see if I got this right. Oh, I'm going to tell my last story is about Caseville. And I love Caseville. It's up in the thumb, right there near the tip of the thumb, was settled in 1836, and they called it Pigeon River Settlement. It was also called the Mouth. Personally, I think Pigeon River Settlement is a lot better. Yeah. Where are you from? I'm from the Mouth. Thanks. 1852, a guy named William Rattle, who was working for somebody, a wealthy businessman in Cleveland, put up a sawmill. Now, Mr. Rattle had been in San Francisco in 1849 as well. He was a 49er. He also didn't find it. But what he found was that he was quite an administrator. So he came back and he went to work for a guy named Leonard Case. And Mr. Case owned thousands, tens of thousands of acres of land up there. And like I said, it's Pigeon River, then the Mouth, and then they called it Port Elizabeth because both Mr. Case and Mr. Rattle's wives' names were Elizabeth. How handy that was. Well, then in 1856, a guy named Francis Crawford bought 20,000 acres from Mr. Case for a town, and he renamed it. They think that it might have been part of the contract. Because, hey, tell you what, I'm gonna buy all this land for him and give you all this money, and I'm gonna name the town Caseville. And that's how Caseville got its name. So there are a few of the stories that I have about people that you should know, and the rest of and I have my bookmarks, by the way, out on the front desk. I take them and learn a lot more. But the goal of all of my books has always been the same. Just learn more. If you don't agree with me, find where I'm wrong. If you think, wow, that's really interesting, I promise you, there is always more. There's always more information to find someplace. And sometimes it's just like, oh, I didn't know that. It's fascinating in talking about these surveyors and all the different things that they did. It is. They invented typewriters. They fought in wars. They discovered the source of the Mississippi River. Amazing people, all from Michigan, making a difference. Thank you very much for your time.
Michael, I think I was inspired by your last presentation. With my work, I've talked to a lot of folks, especially this year, who are running for office all over the state. And one of them had a last name that I'm really familiar with because I had a friend who lived down the street with that same name. He happens to be the sheriff in Shiawassee County. I said, your last name is familiar. Do you know there's a street in Flint with your same last name? And he said, yeah, that's my great-great-grandfather, Josiah Ball, who was governor of Michigan in the 70s. And there happens to be a current state rep from this area who lives on the Gulf, and mentioned it to them, and they said, "Whoa, take a picture," and like it's a cool thing. Said, he's in a different party than you. It's a primary. I don't think a picture with you is going to help him out. But I said in January, which they both won the primary, so I said in January we worked together. Yeah. He may not know that. So okay. We know who his probable coworker will be to make sure that they get the information to him down the road. But I was inspired by your talk of these names you hear of that are familiar, but you don't know why. There's oftentimes people and probably a good story behind those names. So thank you, Michael J. And thank you, Paul, for being here, but not speaking. And next week you'll be here. I want to thank Jerry certainly for a great introduction of Michael J. Thank myself for a wonderful inspirational message. I want to thank Dave for doing a great job with Bulletin, Connie for photo, and also Mike Chafee helping us set up and take down as well. Remember what day? Thursday. Now, next week only Thursday. So this isn't like an annual every week, just next week, Thursday. Paul Rosicki will be back sitting at a different table, a little bit closer to the front, talking about Flint municipal elections and ballot proposals. Please remember as you go out about your day to imagine Rotary. And with that, we are adjourned. Oh, next week is on midterm elections. The following week will be on. Okay.